European society. It's really a pleasure to welcome Federica Mogherini at LSE at the hands of the students. I really like this part because, I mean, our students are so active that they took the initiative and they're leading this event, which is really good. And I'm a bit proud of our students, I must admit. I'm also very grateful that Federica Mogherini accepted to speak about topics that are a bit difficult at times. We still call it the Middle East peace process, but there isn't much of a peace process going on. We stick to it because it's nicer than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But at times it's fallen a bit down on the global political agenda. But there are many important aspects which I think is worth stressing, and I think is also interesting to see that generally dynamics that come up in relation to the Middle East peace process are then followed by many other dossiers. It's a bit of a ballon d'essai, it's a bit of a canary in highlighting where the wind is going in European foreign policy cooperation. And I have only two big questions in order to then leave as much room as possible for the Q&A. The first one is really about the substance of the Middle East peace process. In 2014, when you started, those days, your first trip was to Palestine. And in that occasion, you declared that we need a Palestinian state. That is the ultimate goal. And this is the position of all the European Union. And at the time, many parliaments discussed the need to recognize Palestine. Sweden went all the way. Central Eastern European countries had obviously already recognized Palestine in the 1980s. So it looked as if that was the direction of travel, but not much actually came out of it. In your recollection, how did that momentum evaporate? What happened? Was there a moment when you thought, things are changing here?
What a question, Federica. Well, thanks for having me. I would like to thank you, Karen, Aida, an all-women panel here tonight. I'm very excited about that. And thanks to the students for this initiative. I was exchanging a little bit before we started. These are the best times of my days and weeks, and I'm really looking forward to our exchange tonight. So really grateful for that, and thanks for having me. My greetings from Bruges, where I'm now trying to manage the College of Europe, where I know that we have some of your fellow students being here and some of our students going there. I mean, there's a community here that is family. Federica, going straight to the point of your first question, indeed, I was just now remembering and recollecting those times and those moments, even the thinking, the planning of that first official visit. Because you study international relations, there is a symbolism behind the first visits or the first trips. And for me, there were two moments of that kind in 2014. One, it was in July 2014 when I was an Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, starting the Italian presidency at the time, and at the same time being candidate to becoming the HRVP. I decided to do three symbolic trips in July 2014, so in the first month of the Italian semester of presidency. One of them was in the 6 Western Balkan partners countries. One was to Ukraine and Moscow. And the third one was to Israel and Palestine. And that was exactly when the war started in Gaza at the end of July 20, a very tense moment. Then the decision I took as I started as a high representative in Brussels was indeed, as you reminded, to have the first visit outside of the European Union to Gaza, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, to send a clear message. My advisors in the European Union were very skeptical about me doing that as a first move, but I wanted to send a clear signal. The message being, this is the easiest of the conflicts we have around us to be solved in practical terms, because everybody knows what the end game would be in sustainable terms. Thousands of pages have been written, thousands of meetings have been held, all the parties know what is the landing zone. So it is possible to achieve peace. You said rightly so, I mentioned that so many times. We say Middle East peace process, we should actually say lack of Middle East peace process. We should adjourn the acronym. But on the other side, you said it's nicer than saying Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is also more correct, because it's not only an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict on one side and an Israeli-Arab conflict on the other side. It's a mix, it's an over-layered conflict. And so my message there was, Europe is ready to support a solution, pragmatic, with all the instruments we have and all the political weight we can throw behind that. And I wanted to do it at the beginning of my mandate because I knew perfectly well that conditions over time might have changed. And yes, there was a moment when this clicked, and I'll tell you something about that in a moment. But I also knew that I needed to send out this message at the beginning of the mandate, because then I needed all the 5 years, if the political will was there, try and build the conditions for that to happen. And I mentioned political will because my own takeaway of the experience I've had, and I visited Israel, Palestine, on all the related and connected regional and international powers in these years, is that it is still the easiest conflict to solve on paper. We all know what a solution would look like. But it is also the conflict on which there is the less of a political will, both in the two camps. In one, there is less than another, but I would say that in both camps, the issue of political will is the key element, and in international players that are needed to come to a solution to it. Now, in 2014, we had a very committed US administration. And this is also one of the reasons why I tried to position the European Union on the map, because there was a real option for going for an agreement. With the change of US administration, things changed completely. And it was very clear in that moment that there was no option for a solution. Because I spent 5 years and before that and after that in unofficial positions to argue that the European Union foreign policy power is consistent and considerable, but there are some files on which the European Union alone can definitely not solve. We need others to come in, and that is one of those. Without the United States, a solution is not envisageable. With the United States alone also is not sustainable. So we were at a certain moment trapped in a situation where the United States and Europe were diverging in their approaches. The region was diverging in their approaches. The Arab countries were very much divided in their approaches, because the Arab Peace Initiative, being one of the pillars of the possible roadmap, was somehow contradicted in action by some of the Arab leaders, having some others more concerned about the consequences on the ground. Here I have to say the country, the Arab country with which we have, as Europeans, always most naturally aligned with is Jordan. That is probably the Arab country that has more of an insight on the reality of the ground because of the role that His Majesty, the King of Jordan, plays on the holy places. And so there is a sort of compulsion to care and to take care of the situation on the ground. But we have seen divisions in the Arab League that have been more relevant than the divisions we have seen in the European Union member states. So if you combine the change of the US administration, the split in the Arab world, very significant, and the piling up of other conflicts that were taking the spotlight much more than this one, and also, I have to say, some fatigue on the Palestinian side in terms of engagement, in terms of reforms, in terms of also consistency on the line of negotiation, regardless of the very good will of Abbas, but also a certain confusion around him about the leadership. And we see this obviously clearly now. This has led to a moment when, yes, around the change of the US administration, it was clear that it was not going to happen. But I have to say, when I said, I perfectly remember the moment. I was in Gaza. I was visiting a school and the center of UNRWA in Gaza, a little bit of tension from our security guys. And I said with how do you say it in English, the speaker, the loudspeaker, I said, I believe this objective of having a Palestinian state is achievable within my 5 years mandate. I believed it was possible, and I still believe it would have been possible if the stars had aligned in a different manner during those 5 years.
What about nowadays? Do you still believe it is possible? And if what are more generally, what should be the focal points of the discussion? Because much of the last few months and years have been about, annexation, no, not annexation, no, trying to find different ways which, really don't reflect the EU position. Now that you're free of your responsibilities, what do you think?
No, I've always been convinced on this topic, but also in general terms, in difficult mediation processes or negotiation processes around conflicts, I've always been convinced that the key point is identifying the key interests that move the players around the table. And to me, it continues to be, the key element continues to be the sustainability of the situation for Israel. Where are you heading to? Are you heading towards a one-state solution with a majority of Palestinian citizens staying a democracy? Do you really envisage that as a perspective? Is it going to work? So to me, and to the Palestinian side, what do you want to do with your people, with your administration, with your own leadership? There is an issue there as well, and it shouldn't be a taboo. It shouldn't be a taboo. So you have somehow a formal element of the negotiation, and that is the parameters that are set out very clearly, the UN framework. And obviously the European Union sticks to that. The international community should stick to that. I don't know how far the Biden administration will rejoin them, to be seen. I have the impression that this is not a priority for anyone in the world nowadays. That is a sad element, that as conflict grows old, it becomes less relevant because there are new elements, new conflicts, new crises that are more on the spotlight and take the headlines. So you get used to old conflicts and you forget them. But So you have this official setup, you have this official framework. And I think that still the European Union, together with a few others in the world, very few, on a formal level, manages to stick to that, the parameters and the UN framework. But then on the other side, and this has been what I have personally discussed also with Netanyahu several times, and I was noticing in the picture you have used for this event, there's a very smiling photo with me and Zarif, a very smiling photo with me and Abbas, and a very worried photo of me with Netanyahu. I've had ups and downs in my relation with Netanyahu, but simply because we are both very direct people and we've always discussed issues very openly. And I would say we have a very direct and open channel of communication. And I've always discussed this with him very openly and saying, okay, what is your perspective? What is your end game? How do you imagine the future 10 years from now? How is it going to look like? And I have to say, the answer was not there. So I think that today, in the absence of interest from the international community and from the region, because the other elements to be considered is this, apart from a couple of countries in the Arab world, I mentioned Jordan, that's one of them for sure, Egypt, because of, geography matters. Whenever you share borders, you have to care of what happens. But apart from that, I think the Palestinians feel somehow betrayed by the Arab community. And that's understandable. So in the framework of a lack of interest from the international community, from the region, and a frustrating exercise for decades now, I think the only key that could restart the engine for real would be an element of awareness on the Israeli side of the unsustainability of the trajectory for themselves, the self-interest. How am I going to sustain this trend over time? Staying a democracy. That is the main point, staying a democracy. This is a question Israel has never answered to, and I think that at certain moments they will have to.
Well, today there are elections in Israel.
Indeed, and I was about to say this is going to be, I think, one of the key elements. I'm not sure about the key elements because Israel and Italy share not only the alphabetical order in the UN system, but also the tendency of having repeated electoral cycles without too much certainty about the outcome. So you never know if Israeli elections are going to be one of many or the decisive ones, but for sure, elections in Israel and the political dynamics in general in Israel are going to be determinant. Yes.
I am conscious that, I don't want the Middle East peace process to sort of monopolize the entire time, but I'll ask you one last question about the state of European integration on this, because it seems to me that the EU member states have never been so divided as they are now. And in a way, it was interesting because it's a trend that started to emerge during your time as a High Representative and Vice President. And I wondered, again, there too, whether there was a moment when you started thinking, it's getting a bit too sparse in the middle to find the consensus. And what is your recollection of that period? But also, is there a chance of finding a middle ground that offers a substantial contribution to the debate? What do you think?
Yes, I have to say there was a moment when I felt clearly there was a danger of profound division. And then this is an anecdote that tells everything. And then came the very first visit of Netanyahu to Brussels after decades. And he came to a Foreign Affairs Council. And that was just after Trump announced the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. And it came, again, it's quite unique that the prime minister, and especially the prime minister of Israel, comes to a foreign affairs council, meeting foreign ministers of the, at the time, 28 member states. But it was somehow a decisive moment. It was somehow a bet, a challenge. It was not, when you have these moments where you realize you're doing something important, but you're not completely aware of what the outcome will be. So you're taking a risk. But it was clearly a decisive moment. And there I felt, before the meeting started, I felt, okay, here we risk to blow it up. It's potentially going to be a complicated elements to manage. And then what happened was that we had our, it was a lunch, it was an informal lunch. So we had a closed door conversation, only ministers in the room and him and myself. And what happened was that he advocated for member states of the European Union to do the same as the Americans were doing. And the first or the second minister to take the floor was from Eastern Europe. I would not say the country. And there I thought, okay, this is it. I will have to reflect on what I say in the press room afterwards. And then this minister said, Prime Minister, we appreciate what you said. We are friends, we are family, we're brothers and sisters, but we're not going to follow the US policy. And at that moment, I realized there was still space for us to work together. That was probably the last moment of unity of the European Union member states on this topic. But it was a moment when I was very proud of our member states. Netanyahu left without giving a press point at the end of the meeting, and my press room was very easy. And since then, the pressure became stronger on EU member states. And the frustration of the member states that didn't see any progress on the Middle East peace process itself was growing more and more every day. So indeed, today, I think we see a divided scene within the European Union member states. But I still think there is a glimpse of hope of uniting again the European Union member states on a Middle East peace process, because I still remain convinced, I'm stubborn, that the framework, the end game is still the same. This is the only conflict where you can move things around, but the end game is very well known. The only thing that is not known is how to get there in terms of political consent. But the result, the solution to the conflict is already there. I mean, we don't have to invent anything, and there is no other alternative to solve it, rather than the one that has been somehow defined in, well, now it's a few years ago. It's more than a few years ago. But this to say, I'm still convinced that if and when, if is the bigger part than the when, the US administration and the Israeli administration will tackle the issue seriously, sitting down together and saying, okay, how do we handle this for real? For real. How is it going to look like 20 years from now? That will be the moment when Europeans will be not only united again, but needed. Because in my exchanges with, especially with Kushner in the years of the Trump administration, and I had very frank discussions with him, I used with him the image of the kids that go to the mother or the father to try and get a more positive answer to a quest. If mom says no, maybe you can go to dad, and he might say yes, and vice versa. And I told our American friends in that time, Palestinians and the Israelis are going to do exactly like that with Europeans and Americans. And the only way parents can handle that is to agree what to say. And if you have the United States and Europe divided or on different lines, even on different narratives on what is the perspective, for Palestine and Israel, the two parties will never come together because they know they can refer each of them to some, and this will never bring them together. So I think that if the US administration will at a certain time reopen the file for Syrians, and the Israeli administration at a certain time will look seriously at what can be sustainable over time for themselves, for their own democracy, for their own state, for their own security, for their own relation with the region, then that would be the moment when the Europeans will be asked to step up to the role they can and have to play, and nobody else can play that role apart from Europeans, in terms of financing the process, sustaining the process politically, gathering and building international consensus over it, working with the region all around Israel and Palestine to make it comfortable for everybody to come in. That is a role that only the European Union can and member states can do for real. First and foremost, because of the money we've put in that. But not only for that, for the credibility, for the links, for the honest broker approach. But first, political conditions have to align, and they are not aligning yet. But one day, hopefully, inshallah.
Great, thanks for that, Federica. First of all, I'd like to echo my thanks to the European Society for this wonderful initiative that the students have taken. I wanted to move to the Iran nuclear agreement in 2015. I think this is probably, I would argue, the EU's biggest foreign policy success. I mean, not only in terms of having the internal unity to go with it, but leading the world in the big powers. And particularly in the beginning, standing up to a U.S. administration that was utterly not convinced of the value of reaching an agreement with Iran, and yet the European Union managed to do this. And you were there when to conclude the deal. So definitely, when I think one of the highest points of EU foreign policy in possibly forever. I mean, definitely one of the biggest successes. And then it went horribly, horribly wrong when the Trump administration came into power. So I was just sort of looking back on it. Were you and the other sort of EU ministers taken aback by the Trump move, or were you prepared for it? What do you think the EU should have done differently to try to handle this this kind of this blow from the Trump administration, destroying one of the finest creations of EU diplomacy? Just was there anything you could have done differently?
It was not, I agree with you, it was probably the biggest success of EU diplomacy ever, but maybe not forever, who knows. But also it was one of the major successes of multilateral diplomacy ever, because this was quite a unique combination of factors. And I was reflecting upon that earlier today when I was recalling the extraordinary format of the negotiations. The unique case of a UN Security Council resolution that determines that the High Representative of the European Union facilitates a multilateral negotiation process on non-proliferation, a completely unique setup. That gave a lot of strength. You're right. I came in, I have to say, at the end of the long process. It started in 2003, and I came in at the end of 2014, so long after it started. And we managed to conclude negotiations some 7 months after I started. I participated in many bilateral and partially multilateral meetings at ministerial level, but mainly to the big two major rounds, one in Lausanne in March, April 2015, and then those endless, a sort of experiment of lockdown ante litteram, 3 weeks locked into the Coburg Hotel in Vienna without getting out of the hotel for 3 weeks was quite an experience. And indeed, something that not everybody knows is that not only the European Union negotiated and mediated and facilitated that process, but the actual result of the JCPOA, the actual result of the agreement itself, was basically drafted by the European Union team with a remarkable element of skills and competencies that the European Union team, by the way, largely composed by women, as other teams around the table, were putting, especially on the two most difficult elements of the agreement, which was the sanction relief mechanism, and the European Union has some expertise on economic sanctions, that's clear, but also on the nuclear-related issues, on the technical nuclear-related commitments that Iran was signing up to. So the 100 and plus pages of the text literally were written by the EU team, and sometimes over night sessions that were quite tense and confused. But we were aware, when we concluded the agreement, we were perfectly aware that this would have been challenged, in particular in Iran and in the United States. We were aware of that. Zarif and Kerry were perfectly aware of that. They had the support of their leadership, but they knew that that was a starting point. The starting point that was there on the 14th of July, French National Day of 2015, was a starting point, first of all, for the implementation of the agreement. We had a very strict calendar of measures that needed to be taken to the implementation day, and that happened smoothly. But most of all, we were aware of the politics around that, of the dynamics that the internal debates in Iran and the United States would have generated. And it didn't go well, but it went well at the beginning on both sides, and the plan was to build upon that. Indeed, the idea was, and this is reflected on the preliminary part of the agreement, on the preamble, the idea was this is only nuclear, but then we're going to build on it as we implement it over time and expand the scope of cooperation to regional issues, to arms control, to conflicts in the area. And it's not coincidence that a few months after the signing of the agreement, we started the Syria International Support Group for the first time with Iran at the table. And that was the last time that the Security Council of the United Nations managed to adopt a consensual Security Council resolution on Syria. That was a direct consequences of that. So the idea was to build on that and try to move from the implementation of the nuclear deal towards the cooperation on solving issues in the region, ballistic missiles, Syria, Yemen, different other things. Afghanistan even, because Iran is not only a Middle Eastern country, it's also an Asian country. So that was the idea, but then the time was too limited. We signed in July 2015, implementation day in January 2016, and then the US elections. So we didn't have time to build on it. The trust didn't have time to be developed, to be nourished. We I would say Europeans and probably also Americans didn't expect probably the Trump election. Personally, I did. But that is because, as an Italian, you always, when you say in Italy, when you say everything is possible, you normally expect the worst, differently than in the US or in the Anglo-Saxon world. But we knew it was a risk, but we didn't expect that. The contingency plan was there. We had prepared that. I have to say, this is one element of key foreign policy issues on which the European Union member states always kept remarkable unity. Never once one member state said or did anything to endanger the unity of the European Union, and that allowed us, as you said, to keep the world united behind that. It was literally 3 or 4 countries in the world working against the JCPOA at that time, the United States, Israel, and a couple of Gulf countries, and that's it. But we had a contingency plan foreseen, indeed, before Trump announced the withdrawal of the United States. Here, I would like to specify one thing. Sometimes this is referred as the United States having decided to step out of the agreement. Technically, because we had foreseen that, the JCPOA is not a treaty. It's not an international treaty, was not ratified by national parliaments. So this was also something we considered carefully before deciding the format of the agreement. And this was technically an annex to a Security Council resolution that was unanimously adopted a few days after the signature in Vienna. So what Trump literally announced was that the United States were stopping implementing a Security Council resolution that they voted on. And this helped the narrative of preserving the multilateral agreements in place. Could have we done something differently? Not really. Not really. I think that what we did was the maximum we could do given the context, and that was mainly keeping the European unity in support of the agreement, keeping the international unity in support of the agreement, keeping the credibility of the UN and the Security Council somehow alive, and most importantly to me, keeping the Iranians committed for a long time, because it's only very recently that the Iranians have started to stop implementing some of their nuclear commitments. But for long months and years, they have stayed 100% compliant with their own commitments of the agreement. And that was a miracle. That was a miracle. And that was a miracle that was provoked by the fact that Europeans, and I perfectly remember that evening, I was in Rome, by the way, not in Brussels that day. That evening, we were in a couple of hours after Trump announcement, went out to the press and said, we are committed to the agreement as long as Iran stays compliant. We call on you to stay compliant. And that was shutting the door to any attempt on the Iranian conservative side to say the Americans are out, we are also out. Because if you have the Europeans plus the Russians and the Chinese saying we are in, but you have to be in as well, lock them in. That was the trick. I think we couldn't have done better than that. Then there was another element that didn't work, but that is a structural problem that we have, and we found out in that moment we had that problem, and that is the interlinks between the European and the American economies and banks and investments made it impossible for Europeans to legitimately invest and trade with Iran without the American consent. No bank, no big company would have dared to expose itself to the extraterritorial impact of US sanctions. None of them. And that exposed, I think, the weakness of the European autonomy vis-a-vis a decision that Europeans believed was illegal, illegitimate, but had an effect on our economic players. And that was the real shortcoming of the entire exercise. I'm sorry, I've been very long, but the question requested an elaborated answer.
Absolutely. I still have another question that I'd love to ask, but what I'm going to do is take, there are already a couple of questions from students in the chat. So I'll just kind of relay them to you. And then if there are more questions from students, please do put them in the chat. So the first question comes from Erica Passini. Essentially is, are the Palestinians going to be forgotten? As European countries strike different alliances with different Arab countries, such as France with Emirates, are they being forgotten? And then I'll kind of group these questions, and so you can kind of choose what aspects you want to focus on. And then a second question from one of your own College of Europe students who wants to know how the EU balanced human rights considerations with non-proliferation considerations in the dialogue with Iran, and what's the potential future? What are the future? What's the future of this agreement? And then I'll just add a third question, since we might be running out of time, from actually one of my own students. We're studying EU in the world, Malcolm Kavanagh, who has a question about Western Sahara, so slightly further to the west. But the Trump administration recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara, much to the ire of the European Union. And do you think that EU-US cooperation now, with the Biden administration in place on Western Sahara, will be able to proceed? What are the chances of successful mediation in that particular conflict? So I'll hand back over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to address them all, but I'm not sure I'll manage to do it in this 10 minutes. First of all, the Palestinians will not be forgotten by Europeans, that's for sure. I'm very much aware of the fact that the Palestinian issue is even almost a domestic issue in some of the European Union member states, sometimes ideologically colored, but it's not going to disappear. On that, I'm pretty comfortable. But to be honest, I think the Palestinians risk to be forgotten by their Arab brothers and sisters. I can share with you an anecdote that was very embarrassing for me. I will not mention the country where this happened, but this happened. I was visiting a very important Arab country, and I had a very good bilateral meeting with the foreign minister. Then we went to the press room, and he spoke at length about all the issues we had tackled and discussed, from Syria to Libya, whatever, EU-Arab world cooperation, everything. And then it was my turn, and I also mentioned Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Middle East peace process, or lack of Palestinian Middle East peace conflict, peace process. And because we did discuss that actually, and then the minister felt that he had to complement that and said, obviously we've discussed that, and I didn't mention that because it was obvious for me. But this is, I think, a very, if you take it from a Freud point of view, it's a very eloquent indicator of the fact that the risk is there, I believe, that the Arab world forgets about the Palestinians because there are more pressing issues for them to tackle at this stage. Even Europeans have more pressing issues to tackle, but I think that there is still a sense of moral duty to protect international law and to try and make this cause end up in a sustainable place. It's a matter of human rights at the end. And the European Union, never to forget that, has invested a lot of money to that. And money for the European Union is not an irrelevant element. The money that the European Union has spent is to build the Palestinian state. And where is that money going if the Palestinian state is not built? So I don't see the Europeans forgetting the Palestinians, but I see the risk that the international community and the Arab world does, which is a sad element to share, but is my assessment of the reality. Then going to the question on Iran, and I'm reading it now. Great to see that we have a College of Europe student from NATO following us tonight. First, on human rights, the European Union has been always very bold everywhere, I have to say, but on Iran as well. So the moment when we signed the agreement, everything stayed as it was. Sanctions related to nuclear were lifted in the moment of the implementation of the nuclear commitments Iran had taken. So in January 2016, so six months later. But all the non-nuclear related sanctions stayed from the European Union side. And in particular, all the human rights related sanctions stayed in place. And all the marches, all activities, all support also to civil society and human rights activists remains in place from the European Union side. And also all the individual cases were always tackled, also including in my bilateral talks with Zarif or even with Rouhani. I visited Iran, I think 3 or 4 times in my mandate. And always, it was never only a matter of nuclear related issues. There were always at least 3 or 4 topics on the agenda. The nuclear deal, for sure, that was a starting point always, but also the regional situation, being it Syria or Afghanistan or Yemen or Iraq, and also bilateral cooperation, because there is some important bilateral cooperation between Iran and Europe, and human rights related issues, and rule of law and democracy is a big word here. But still, Iran has a democratic dynamic, or at least a political dynamic inside, within its own political life. There is a difference if the outcome of the election is in one direction or another. Let's put it this way. It's not all the same. And this allows me to answer to the second part of the question, what could happen after the Iranian elections that happen in June. This is what worries me the most. I'm not worried about the possibility for Iran and the United States to both go back to full compliance. I think that is absolutely feasible, possible, and in the interest of all. What worries me is the mismatch of calendar priorities. I think that for the Biden administration, the Iran file is important but controversial. And I have the impression that Biden needs to address bipartisan issues first to try and unite the political spectrum in Congress before entering into divisive issues. And Iran is a divisive issue even within the Democratic camp in Congress. So I'm not completely sure. I'm sure that the Biden administration has the intention of tackling the issue seriously. And the appointment of Rob Malley as an Iran envoy and of Wendy Sherman at the State Department speak volume. I mean, these are the 2 most prominent and knowledgeable people in the US administration on Iran and on the Iran nuclear deal. You couldn't find anybody, and they don't need advice, they don't need insights, they know everything about that. But I wonder whether this would be one of the key elements of priority for the Biden administration foreign policy from now to the next couple of months. Probably not. There's China, there's Russia, there's Afghanistan, seriously speaking, there's an entire world out there. I'm not sure this would be priority number 1. And Iran doesn't have time because they have presidential elections coming up in June. And if no sign comes before the June presidential elections in Iran, there is indeed risk that there's a change in policy and in leadership in Iran that then creates a different kind of political alignment of stars that makes it more difficult, rather impossible, to go back to full compliance. Because in Iran, as much as in the United States, the deal is controversial. And not everybody has supported it. So this to say that the sequencing and the timing is essential here. And if we miss that window from now to June, we might be in a good place even after June. It depends on the Iranian political dynamics, but we might be in a place where it's relevant that we talk about that. Because at that stage, Iran might not be interested in anything at all in terms of restoring the JCPOA. And then the US would also be completely out of interest for that. And that would be, I think, a real disaster. Because the alternative to the nuclear deal being fully restored is a nuclear arms race in the region, which is extremely dangerous, especially for us Europeans, because we're next door. So I don't want to end on a bleak scenario, but I really hope that our friends in Washington manage to find the political space to make some moves, at least some moves. I don't expect full compliance in 2 months, but a sequencing of steps that signal the intention. You know how it works in diplomacy. You start the process, and the existence of a process is in itself a good sign and keeps you hooked. That is what is needed, I think, in this moment. I think that for the sake of time, and also because it's a little bit out of topic, I will skip the Western Sahara question. Malcolm will forgive me for that, maybe next time.
Yeah. I'm sure he will. And there were loads of other great questions coming in, but we have run out of time. I think you've generated an incredible amount of interest, and I'm sure that we would love to invite you back to hear more at some point. So I'm just going to wrap it up now to thank Federica Mogherini for taking the time to speak to us this evening, to thank all of the participants for joining us, and above all, to thank the European Society for organizing this event. I think it's been a really fabulous and insightful event, letting us know what it's like to be a mediator on behalf of the European Union in a very difficult world. So we thank you all, and take care.
Thank you all, and take care and stay safe. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.